Yo dog, so in 19 whatever, some Soviet guy called Nikolai Kardashev looked out at the universe and wondered, how could we categorize alien civilizations like different types of Pokemon cards? And his answer became the single most quoted thing by every amateur space nerd. Basically, there are 3 tiers based purely on how much energy a civilization can get its grubby little hands on. Harnessing the power of a planet gets you to type 1, harnessing an entire star system gets you to type 2, and harnessing an entire galaxy gets you to type 3. It's elegant, it's simple, it's certainly been the backbone of thousands of YouTube thumbnails with glowing Dyson spheres in the background. It might also be kind of dumb. Today I want to try and figure out whether ranking aliens based on how big their power bill is actually makes any sense, and whether the cleverest counter-argument against it also actually proves the opposite of what it thinks it does. Yeah, now we're talking, right? Let's dig into it. So Kardashev's original pitch was basically about detectability. If you're hunting for extraterrestrial civilizations, the easiest thing to spot from several light years away isn't their culture or how cool their cars look, it's their energy signature. So Kardashev came up with a yardstick based on power consumption. A Type 1 civilization has roughly the total energy budget of its entire home planet. That doesn't necessarily mean it just exists on a planet. Realistically, a Type 1 civilization is probably going to be a solar system-wide civilization, but between all of the different methods of power generation that they have, they'll be able to harness roughly the same amount of power that exists in total on its home planet. Now, a Type 2 civilization commands the total energy output of its entire host star. That's about 10 to the 26 watts. And Type 3 can harness the output of an entire galaxy, which is another multiplication of a few hundred billion. Ultimately, a Type 3 civilization is just tens or hundreds of billions of Type 2 civilizations stapled together. Now, Carl Sagan later smoothed out this whole scale and reimagined it as a continuous logarithmic scale. That way you can actually plot a civilization's exact fractional position rather than forcing every single civilization into one of 3 really broad categories. Humanity currently is about a Type 0.7 something, but remember, the scale's logarithmic. There are single farms that exist that are a 0.2 on their own. The entire Roman Empire was probably like a 0.4. So again, just because we live on a planet doesn't make us a fully fledged Type 1 civilization. Anyway, here's the most obvious problem with the Kardashev scale, and you've probably already thought of it if you've spent more than 4 minutes thinking about it. The Kardashev scale measures how much energy you burn, not whether you're actually doing anything intelligent with it. Kardashev's original logic was that a civilization that builds a Dyson swarm, for example, purely to power an infinite server farm generating AI slop erotic fanfiction of their own planet's extinct megafauna or something, is definitionally more advanced than a species that mastered some elegant minimal footprint fusion power and used it to cure death and write wonderful poetry or whatever. We would say that one of these societies is more advanced than the other and objectively better to live in, but the scale wouldn't really care. The scale only cares about the electricity bill. But that's not necessarily wrong, that's just how the scale works, right? We're not trying to rank wisdom, we're just describing how much energy a species happens to be pushing through its civilization, full stop. There's no judgments implied with that, although this doesn't stop nearly everybody from assuming that a Type 2 civilization would be better, smarter, more evolved in every way than, for example, we are now. It's just that the scale really was never built to communicate that. There have been other scales developed to try and patch this hole. For example, we could rank civilizations not by how much of the universe they can harness, but how small a scale of matter they can precisely manipulate, from macroscopic objects all the way down to the fabric of space-time itself. This is called Barrow's scale, and a civilization that masters nanotechnology and quantum engineering whilst sipping a modest amount of energy would rank as wildly more sophisticated on that scale than a civilization with a bunch of Dyson spheres but that doesn't do anything particularly advanced with them. These are basically 2 totally different definitions of advanced, and Kardashev's original scale just measured one of them. Raw, dumb, thermodynamic capability. So it's not wrong, but you could argue that it's incomplete in some way, which is where the question actually gets interesting, I think, because the main argument against the Kardashev scale goes something like this. Technology doesn't just get more powerful over time, it gets more efficient, right? A modern LED produces the same light as an old incandescent bulb, but uses roughly, a tenth of the energy, or whatever it is. A modern CPU does a lot more computation per watt than a computer from 20 years ago, by several orders of magnitude. So if you extrapolate that trend forward across centuries or millennia, you get an interesting possibility, which is maybe that the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy aren't the ones frantically wrapping their stars in solar panels. Maybe they're the ones who figured out how to run an entire post-biological society, uploaded minds, whatever, and doing all of that with a tiny amount of power, because they've engineered themselves down to the thermodynamic limits of computation or whatever. This idea of efficiency has been floated around quite a lot, and we could use other scales. A civilization that prioritizes computation and information efficiency efficiency over sheer energy output might do more with a lot less. They might think more, come to better conclusions, and therefore probably be the best candidate for what we would call advanced, even though theoretically that would only be a rounding error compared to what we might consider to be a Kardashev 1 or 2 or 3 civilization. You know, maybe we haven't found type 2 or type 3 civilizations because our entire search strategy is calibrated to detect civilizations that share this sort of more energy equals progress philosophy. So maybe real advanced civilizations get quieter and more efficient as they mature, and therefore shrink their energy footprint instead of growing it, which is the opposite of what Kardashev's assumption was. Of course, we wouldn't be seeing Dyson spheres all over the place if that were the case. And no, it's not because Dyson spheres don't make sense because that one video told you that it doesn't make sense. They do make sense. Just don't get me started. Sorry to interrupt, this is just a quick message to say, statistically speaking, you're probably not subscribed, so I'll make you a deal. Press the subscribe button and I won't come over to your house and do this.
Yo, bro, you could crack that window for me real quick? Yeah, I got you, bro.
Alright, thanks. Back to the video. Now that seems like an interesting rebuttal, right? Advanced technology trends towards efficiency rather than raw scale. It would mean that the Kardashev scale isn't just incomplete, it might actually be structurally backwards, ranking loud and wasteful above quiet and better. However, I don't agree with this. Funnily enough, the reason is highly related to a Hank Green video that came out like 2 weeks ago. It's something called the Jevons paradox, and I think this relates directly. The Jevons paradox is like a 200-year-old economic phenomenon that says the efficiency argument might be completely wrong, based on the actual observed historical behavior of humans at the very least, and what I would consider to be generalizable behavior for a species which is acting in at least a fairly rational way. Basically, back in the 1800s, England was worried that it would run out of coal, and the proposed solution was, well, we can just make steam engines more efficient, and we'll burn less coal per unit of work. And Jevonsy McJevons face crunched the numbers and actually came to the opposite conclusion. As steam engines got more efficient, coal consumption didn't fall, it exploded. People were thinking, naturally, that if coal power is more efficient, you won't need to use as much of it to do the work that we're already doing. But the reality was that the increased efficiency made coal power way cheaper, which made it economically sensible to use in a bunch of applications that weren't economical before, which meant even though each individual use of it was more efficient, the increase in different uses of it grew vastly more than the efficiency caused the consumption to go down. So overall, we burnt a lot more coal than we had done before, not less. You know, things that previously would have been unthinkable because they would have just been a gigantic waste of coal with the previous iteration of steam engines, now were things that were actually feasible, so people were looking into them, coming up with inventions that only work and are economically sensible when burning coal is at least vaguely efficient. So this whole thing is called the Jevons paradox, and it's repeated itself with almost comedic levels of consistency ever since. LED bulbs use 1/10 the energy of incandescence, and total global energy spent on lighting has not meaningfully dropped, because cheap light means that you can put lights on everything, everywhere, all the time. Cars have gotten way more fuel efficient over the last 50 years, but total fuel consumption climbed anyway. Cheaper per mile driving means people just drive more because they can afford to. They can afford to live further from work. They can afford to go on holidays by driving to the place where they're going in their car. They can afford to have a more efficient engine in a bigger car, which then makes it the same efficiency as a car was already, but just with more space inside of it, or just egregiously large for no reason, I guess. Also, compute has undergone huge efficiency gains per calculation over the past decade, and total energy consumption from AI data centers notoriously has gotten ridiculously high, because cheaper thinking just means everyone immediately demands 10,000 times more thinking all the time, forever, increasingly, for increasingly deranged purposes. And this whole mechanism is simple, right? Higher efficiency lowers the cost of doing a thing, and a lower cost almost always unlocks more demand than the efficiency gain saves, because human and presumably alien desire for more stuff is not a fixed quantity that efficiency merely needs to satisfy. It's an expanding balloon that efficiency actively inflates by making bigger dreams now possible, or affordable if you want to put them in economic terms. So if you give a civilization 10 times more efficient computers, history's track record says that they won't use 1/10 of the power to do the same thinking. They will use the same or more power to do 1,000 times more thinking, because now they can, and that unlocks more possibilities, lets them do more stuff. They'll probably discover some more bullshit and then find a way to make that more efficient as well. So the efficiency counter argument against the Kardashev scale, that advanced civilizations use less energy so the Kardashev scale is measuring the wrong thing, I think runs into a bit of a wall, because at least historical evidence for human beings suggests the opposite. And again, I don't think this is necessarily just limited to humans. Broadly speaking, more resources mean more possibility to do more things, and wanting to do that will be good for survival, and wanting to do things which are good for survival will have been evolutionarily selected for in any species that continues to exist. If they're a Kardashev 2 civilization or something, they needed to exist long enough to become that in the first place. I suppose they could have become an advanced civilization and then somehow like genetically modified themselves to not have that impulse anymore, more, but you can basically sum up that entire situation as a species just choosing to delete itself from existence for some reason. I don't think it's a particularly rational thing to do. I think people nowadays can kind of talk themselves into thinking that it is a rational thing to do, given like the environmental disasters and shit that are currently happening. And as much of a problem as that is, on the long span of time, that's pretty localized to the point in history that we're currently living in. I'm probably projecting my own worldview on this a little bit, but a civilization of intelligent, conscious creatures is basically the universe becoming aware of itself, which means it's arguably the most important thing in the universe. So I'm not sure why it would destroy itself or voluntarily choose to give itself behaviors that make it less likely to continue to exist. You can disagree with me if you like, but I think if a civilization gets to K2 or K3 or even K1, they would probably agree with this point of view more than they'd agree with the opposite point of view. And that's important because their opinion is kind of the thing that we're talking about, right? So ultimately, I don't think advanced societies plateau at high efficiency and then choose to degrowth themselves on purpose. Something to bear in mind is that since we all live on planet Earth and every joule of energy that we use doesn't vanish, it gets converted into heat and dumped back into the environment, it means that enough waste heat destabilizes the very biosphere and climate systems that we depend on to continue to exist at the moment. Now, in our current situation, that will eventually be a hard cap on how much we can increase our energy output. We are going to need to expand into space at some point, not necessarily soon. I don't think the cap is right here, right now, but if the Earth ever ends up with like hundreds of billions of people on it, yeah, sure, we're going to need to start thinking about expanding into space, whether we're building space colonies or putting fusion power generators in space somewhere, or whether we go straight to building solar energy collectors directly in orbit of the sun, and, you know, eventually if you do that for thousands of years, it just kind of becomes a Dyson swarm over time. There is one potentially human-centric aspect to this, which is that humans tend to want more humans around. The carrying capacity of the Earth is in the many, many trillions if we actually just manage resources effectively. But a lot of the reason why we want more people now is for reasons like what's happening in South Korea, where they're not making enough new people to replace the existing population. And this is seeming to happen more and more in the more developed countries, and developing countries still have a lot more children per family. But that seems like it's also going to plateau and then probably take a similar trajectory over time. This is partly because of lack of access to contraception, but it's also partly because families tend to have more children if the risk of losing those children is quite high. You know, just lack of access to medicine in general. But that whole child rearing situation kind of inverts when people aren't at a huge risk of losing a child, but they are at more risk of economic instability. So like all the men and all the women all need to have professions and so on. So you focus on that and then you don't focus on having kids. There's also the whole fertility window thing, particularly for women. I'm sure people are going to bring up cost of living as well. I'm trying not to overcomplicate this, particularly with factors that primarily apply to us right here, right now, in our particular moment in time. My point is, this whole dynamic depends on us being biologically human, right? But if 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 years from now, we aren't biological things anymore, whether because we're all cybernetically augmented to the point of barely being recognizable, or whether we do some kind of mind upload thing, or whatever the situation is. I mean, maybe we are still biological, but we can just grow babies in vats or something. Additionally, maybe we end up with automated systems doing all the critical work of society for us. Maybe in 100 years, no human being will be required to do any work, because any work that you could do will just be done better by a machine of some variety. Whatever the situation ultimately ends up being in the long span of the future, that could change the dynamic around this kind of safety net of wanting to have lots of kids so that the next generation can provide for the previous one when the previous one get old. If we can just make as many kids as we want to, and there's no threat to their existence because we've basically hard solved medicine, and also none of them need to do any physical labor because all of that is done by machines, and also none of them need to do any mental labor because all of that is also done by machines, the philosophical question remains of, okay, how many people do we want then? Do we want to maximize the number of people that we can safely look after with some margin so that we're not maxing ourselves out all the time in terms of resource and energy expenditure? I guess that would be my intuition, but it does at least become slightly more hazy. It is a philosophical question that we ought to ask. If humanity were a K2 civilization, would it be better if that civilization has 1 million people in it, or if it had 1 trillion people in it, or if it had an octillion people in it? Is there a right answer to the number of people we should have? If you think of it from a utility perspective, I suppose if lots of people are having a good time, then you want to have more people, and if lots of people are having a terrible time, then you'll want to have less people. But obviously that gives you fewer people to try and work out the problems, so I don't know, maybe more people is just better, generally speaking. If it is, that gives a better foundation for why species would continuously expand and want more and more energy infrastructure, all the way out to basically consuming their entire galaxy trying to accomplish that. To sum up my whole point here, I do think the Kardashev scale actually makes sense, at least with respect to the aspects of it I've discussed here. And if you don't like that, here's what you do. Get a piece of paper, right? Write down what your opinion is, then roll it up and insert it way up inside your butthole. Done? Okay, cool, so it's time to thank my elite level supporters. Thunderbolt22810, whose cylinder did not remain unharmed. Nomad Gronk, who has a negative number of wives. Andrew Maul, whose colon sometimes falls out, but he shoves that fucker right back in again. JB Jaren, who regularly performs Turing tests on household objects. JDK, who lost his lunch in his pants. Mutantous Doom, whose cylinder rotation was enjoyed by your mother last night. Nikita Lurie, who doesn't know the meaning of the word fear because he never learned how to read. Aaron Rowe, who's gotta be jelly because jam don't jiggle like that. Bonk Chunk, who's a trillionaire in Zimbabwean currency. That one boy, who is the most logistically complex person to ever exist. Trenton Coldwell, whose mother makes a killer cigarette casserole. Jimbo Quiz, who can wear 6 pants per pant. Draco91, who once bought clothes from the soup store. Surreal Melody, who is the reason the boogeyman checks under his bed before he goes to sleep. Enoch Trismegistus, who found the lost city of Atlantis and decided to open a Burger King franchise there. Autumn, whose finger guns are actually lethal. Selena Stopic, who found buried treasure, and by treasure I mean a collection of dirty old magazines, and by found I mean he remembered where he put them. And thanks to all my other supporters too. Don't forget to join the Patreon or the channel membership if you want to be featured in my video credits or chat on the Discord, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Over and out.